I was told before that I needed to start this event with a joke. I'm going to try and do, I might get it wrong. Someone told me this last week and I thought it was really funny. A Roman walks into a bar and says, oh, I need drinks. And the bartender says, oh, how many do you need? And the Roman just, and he says, oh, 5 drinks coming up. Which I loved, and it's kind of a cringe joke, but I guess it also kind of maybe relates to this presentation in a way that you could think about a joke as something that like someone did tell me, that was kind of transmitted to me down a somewhat linear line. And it's something that I've told people in ways that, you know, I could make a list of you all that I've told and people on the weekend. But perhaps that kind of misses quite a lot of the point of the joke, it's kind of sociality. So yeah, kind of setting up for the presentation today. The other place I'd like to start is by acknowledging the Gadigal and Gadigal people as the traditional custodians on the land of whom I'm speaking to you from today. This country I'm grateful to be working on, to be able to walk on, to ponder these ideas on, and to write and to cite on. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and the value of their knowledge and stories for all sorts of learning taking place across the university today. So by way of an introduction, I guess my name is Tara. I completed my PhD, as Madeline said, at UNSW Canberra earlier this year with Dr. Nina Williams and Professor J.D. Dewsbury in cultural geography. And this term I've been teaching a 3rd year course here in urban environments with the Environmental and Society group. And my research is really interested in the relationality of different ideas and modes of thought, specifically looking at how Western and non-Western ideas and thinkers can encounter one another in less exploitative and hierarchical ways, not only to be included, but to be fundamentally changed by this encounter. So an insight into these questions has undoubtedly been shaped by a British and South Asian family and history of movement, both in terms of migration and colonisation, both forced and chosen in some senses, as well as my aunt's career as a classical Indian dancer in the UK, and then choreographic practices which seek to counterpoint Western and non-Western styles of movement. And for me, this interest really takes this idea that all identity is expressive of difference, rather than the more traditional theorization of identity as somehow being kind of ontologically more important than differences. And my thinking and research has really been shaped by the process thinking of 3 men on the board. On the left, Edward Glissant, the late Martinican thinker, who's kind of recently coming to geographers' attention. And on the right, the French thinker Deleuze and Guattari, who kind of gets more well known in geography and Western thinking. Yeah, and kind of interested in ideas of non-representational theory, post-anti-colonial theory, post-humanism, feminist theory, and interest in cinema, fashion, and the arts. So I guess this research is somewhat theoretical, but kind of shaped by my belief that theory is something that's always very practical in a way that, because it shapes thinking, and thinking is that which takes place and which takes space. Is a laboured activity as much as any other, and I'm kind of really interested in how more quotidian academic habits, things like reading and writing and critique, and as I discussed today, citation, are places where this can be done differently. So today's paper, it started life as a paper for the IAG in Perth in 2023, which is kind of about how we conceive of the discipline, disciplinary boundaries and practices, how we encounter the ideas of other researchers, specifically those in the past, and of minority thinkers especially. It then became a chapter in my PhD thesis where I kind of developed Glissant's concept of trembling to think about how citation practices can do this trembling thinking. And since finishing my PhD, I've reworked the literature a lot to kind of give much more of an account of geography's engagement with the analysis and politics of citation. And I've submitted this to Progress, which was accepted last week, pending some revisions and kind of clarifications. So hopefully it will be published soon. So yeah, for people who bought their citations, I guess, yeah, you could maybe have a look at the list. And I guess I was kind of interested in what things are apparent, what kind of patterns maybe you see, what is visible in the citation list, what is not. These can be very kind of straightforward and boring ideas. And if people online had anything, you're welcome to put in the chat. Yeah, what kind of things you notice.
Are you asking about the identities of authors or something broader than that?
Anything. I guess what kind of things are like immediately apparent on the citation list? Yeah, John?
I mean, I guess I would say, right, like, I'm obviously in some ways conservative, like the whole idea, like building on the authorities so people don't bust your chop about the innovation you're making, right? That contribution thing. And I think looking at what I brought for today, I'm like, oh, wow, I was really leaning heavily on sort of the big names in my field to make a much more esoteric point.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Anyone else? Angela?
I was looking through a recent publication that's co-authored with someone, and it's about Pakistan and Palestine, and the reference list is a lot more diverse than when I'm writing on aviation and air, which has tends to have much narrower set of scholars working on it.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Was there another?
All in English?
Yeah.
All the time, so there's a...
Yeah, no, it's definitely a big one. Thank you. Was there another hand? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I experience is also as an editor, in addition to being an author, and as an editor, we see some papers that have like massive reference lists, and some of them have really small reference lists. And so as an editor, you're like, is there a sweet spot, just given the pagination restraints of most journal articles?
Yeah, and I guess I was quite grateful with progress that the reference list isn't included in the WordCat, which again does speak to what the journal is interested in. But yeah, thank you. Michelle says see spiraling space. Like, is that a reference to the drawing on the screen? Yeah, it's a nice way of thinking about it. All of these kind of linear lines. So yeah, hopefully all these things actually that people pulled up, things which the paper kind of touches on and thinks about how this happens. So yeah, thank you for playing along. Skip to page of this. Sorry. So yeah, I guess as well, it's kind of maybe thinking about how there's a lot more to citations than just this kind of very straightforward box ticking exercise which we tell undergraduate students they have to do. And a lot more as well than it's literally just a list of surnames and titles as well. So yeah, that's the introduction. So I suppose easy to gloss over while reading, yet impossible to comprehend of academic work without. Citation is increasingly being raised as one of the key places where geographers can intervene to address the racialized, gendered, colonial, hierarchical, and privileged lines along which the discipline continues to be produced. As this paper will establish, citations emerged during the 20th century as a means of evaluating academic validity, success, and influence. However, dominant practices of citation have been criticised for their complicity with dominant regimes of power, vision, representation, and meaning. And therefore, critical engagements of the politics of citation have demonstrated that changing who we cite can be a powerful tool, and praxis has been targeted towards citing a more diverse range of scholars from minority subject positions in recognition of the serious exclusions from mainstream authorship. The citation has not only a politics, but can be an effective political tool for transformation too. Building on this important work, in this paper, I argue that focusing exclusively on the human subjects who populate citation brackets can only go so far in the direction of challenging the dominant exclusive and exclusionary habits, expectations, and evaluations of the discipline. So all those kind of things that people called out are about more than just human names. Influence and ideas are shaped by the more than human in ways which exceed humanist logics of intent, linearity, rationality, and transparency. And the risk, as I see it, is that only targeting the individuated terms who get cited is that the networks, lines, and relations which create these habits remain intact. So to the politics of human citation advocated by feminist, anti-colonial, indigenous, and anti-oppressive arguments, this paper seeks to contribute something a little bit different, a more than human attunement to how we conceptualize and write citation. Refusing the one-directional linearity of conventional wisdom about citations, this paper draws on cultural geographers' interest in examining a multiplicitous set of lines which give shape to life without constricting what it might yet be, as in more classically structural understandings of life. As geographer Derek McCormick says of this ethos, this is a commitment to the detour as a way of delineating movement. taken off in different directions and at different speeds. Attending to not only the individual points of citation, but to the lines on which these are organised, asks not only which other and marginalised subject positions can and should be included, but goes further by seeking to transform these very lines themselves. So in this paper, I propose my Glissantian conceptualisation of trembling citations, which draws on the work of Edward Glissant to intervene in conventional citations at the more than human level of lines, relations, and processes, as these give shape to life before dominant registers of individualism, sense-making, and disciplinary habits, expectations, and evaluations occur. Such an intervention is important at this critical juncture in which geographers are increasingly seeking to promote the work of individuals from minority subject positions, because trembling targets not only the human surface of these, but engages the more than human terrain on which these engagements take place. As geographers Carrie Mott and Daniel Cochrane write in their important intervention on the politics of citation, through the process of citation, we bring with us those bodies and ideas deemed legitimate and worthy of attention and dialogue. Academics and their arguments certainly shape these, but so too do works of fiction, music, films, and the changes which others incite in us. And the pathways along which these changes occur is rarely the straight and narrow. As Indigenous researchers Lawrence Hine and Michelle Bishop write, when we say peoples, we mean the vast networks of country, kinship, more than humans, ancestors, knowledges, and memories that are attached to and comprise people. People do not exist on their own. Nothing does. Thus, it is not only that there are always other than human influences on our thinking, but that there is always more and more to come in the individual human authors that human logics concede. So I guess maybe three kind of important things to bear in mind, but those perhaps. So semantically, in this paper, kind of in part because it draws together a lot of different arguments about citations from different disciplines, subdisciplines, location and author positions, the dominant citation practices, which are my object of critique, are variously referred to as scientific, paternal, white heteromasculinist, European, settler colonial, Western privileged, and humanist. To do so is not to conflate the differences in these terms, but rather to show how citation remains a big problem for geographers and researchers working from a different range of positions. And while the objects of these critiques may differ, the argument I make in this paper is that it is the lines on which they function, and it is the lines on which they function which operate in one and the same way, along filial, straight and narrow paths. And thus I argue that intervening at this level is capable of making changes in a wide array of directions. Secondly, I'm interested in intervening in the assumptions and ideas which manifest in how we give testament to where ideas come from. And therefore, citation in this paper refers not only to the space of citation brackets and reference lists, but also to conventions like acknowledgements, authorship, figures, images, and formatting. And thirdly, the difference between making sense in rather than making sense of this complexity speaks to this Deleuzean concern of disrupting good and common sense ways of knowing the world, which block our ability to open thought to genuinely new pathways. So for Deleuze, the habits and good sense of the traditions of Western philosophical discourse limit our capacity for genuine thinking, and his whole project is kind of interested in trying to find these genuinely new ways of thought which break with such an image. So I open these photographs, my PhD with these photographs in what I termed a transparent acknowledgement, in a slight tongue of cheek. But I write this research as a mixed race woman who both needs and wants literatures from a whole host of non-dominant and variously voices in order to try and make sense in such complexity. So the impetus for this research came out of a feeling of unease at the simplicity in which important calls to decolonize curricula were to be addressed by simply including works by non-white authors, assuming kind of solutions by merit of the name. And I distinctly remember reading a book during reading group by quite a major theorist, published in 2021, which listed Frantz Fanon as an interlocutor of the book, alongside Foucault, Freud, and Benjamin. Questions of decoloniality and influence of non-white authors were really ripe in the public imagination at this time. And as such, I was surprised at my sense that, despite being listed as an equally major thinker for the book, Fanon was referenced and cited much less frequently and integrally than the other three. And this made me think a lot about the kind of representational weight of my own surname, Jeyasingh, which comes from my dad's South Asian family, albeit chosen relatively recently in the 20th century. And kind of the weight of that, what that citation would do to other people's reading lists, what that kind of indicated and what that meant. So I included the photos on the board, which I guess in some ways there's an easy connection to be made about this kind of familial point of origin, as if I think the way I do because of where my family is from. But as I kind of articulated earlier, there are other ways of thinking about these connections. And yes, these family histories are a really important marker of my positionality and the place which I think from. But this place is not closed off and bounded by questions and lines of filiation and identity. So at the heart of the concerns of this paper then is this contention that while we undoubtedly should read the work of more than Western authors, and these should undoubtedly be included in more expansive citation lists, this must be done in a meaningful way which exceeds simply box-ticking exercises of diversity. There are bigger questions of influence and the politics of ideas which must be addressed too, in order to engage with such authors and ideas in ways which are not only respectful, but which accept their challenge to decenter all sorts of privileges. Citation as a space can not only represent such complexity, but can actually create such reverberations in how we understand our sense of and shape to relation to the world therein. Down that which artist Anne Sala describes as paths other than the highways of existing discourse or meaning. So in this paper, I kind of start off by looking at how geographers and social scientists have engaged with the politics of citation. I then turn to Glissant, his critique of filiation, which he typifies Western knowledge as aspiring to, I perhaps typify conventional citation practices aspiring to, and develop his concept of trembling thinking to think about what I call trembling citations. And I discuss 4 exemplar experiments in this from Lauren Ballant and Kathleen Stewart, Black geography scholar Catherine McKittrick, Baraka Country, and my own typewritten sheets for my PhD projects. So, from a human to more than human politics of citation. Although perhaps seeming timeless, citations in their modern form as indicating ownership of ideas and connecting individual researchers can be traced back only to the 1850s. As Janie Bevan Bavalas shows, the importance awarded to citation was in replacement of academia's previous old boy network, in which decisions of hiring and firing were made on the basis of a particular privileged opinion. And throughout the 20th century, citation gradually came to be indicative of validity, success, and influence of particular sources, individuals, and institutions whom thought gets ascribed to. Citation was apparently unproblematic because, according to prevailing scientism, thinkers like Robert Merton, the mapping between the practice of scientific research and the linguistic and symbolic expressions of that work within the systems of communication is indifferent with respect to direction. So in other words, citation was thought of as nothing more than a neutral reflection of knowledge. However, from the 1960s, social scientists have pointed to flaws in this logic. So Norman Kaplan describes their suspicions that the citation practices of scientists today are in large part a social device for coping with problems of property rights and priority claims. And only incidentally do these citations serve as a careful and accurate reconstruction of the scholarly precursor of one's own contribution. The scholars began classifying different intentions brought to citation with different levels of skepticism. So shown on the screen, Moore-Zwick and Moore-Gessen show that references could be indicative of either the conceptual or the operational content of the reference. They could be organic and necessary for understanding the present work, or a more perfunctory acknowledgement to work in the general area. They could kind of build on the evolutionary foundations or provide a juxtaposition alternative. And they could be confirmative or negational depending on the text. Elsewhere, and perhaps more skeptically, Frederick Seaborn argued that few measures are more susceptible to manipulation and artificial relationships than citation indices, because these can be manipulated by too many extraneous factors other than genuine worth. And these include selecting references to please an editor, only citing researchers working in a particular school, and kind of conspiracies between researchers to improve their own citation scores. So despite claims to neutrality, citation has never travelled lightly. And as well, you kind of get these geographical differences in citation too. So Francois Cousseau's research shows that in France and in kind of French theory, the tradition is that you kind of speak from this individual point. And therefore, as anyone that's kind of tried to read these big French texts knows, there are very few citations and kind of ownership of ideas. In comparison, the US school of theory, which has been based a lot more on kind of showing your literary knowledge and connections, citations there are a lot more important and there are a lot more of them. So you get these kind of geographical and historical differences. Although I don't think he uses the term per se in this argument, the politics of citation is frequently seen to originate with this seminal legal review by American legal scholar Richard Delgado, who is considered one of the founders of critical race theory. In his paper, The Imperial Scholar, Reflections on a Review of Civil Rights Literature from 1984, Delgado found that the work of African American, Hispanic, and Native American scholars was being systematically excluded from civil rights scholarship by that which he describes as an inner circle of about a dozen white male writers who take comment on, take polite issue with, extol, criticize, and expand on each other's ideas. It is something like an elaborate minuet. Delgado argued that this exclusion was not incidental, but directly caused blunting, skewing, and omissions in the literature dealing with race, racism, and American law. Such exclusions took place, he argued, at the level of unconscious action and choice, as opposed to conscious malevolence and crass indifference. And at the same time, roughly in the mid-1980s, there was a surge of geographical interest in the analysis of citation for understanding the spaces of knowledge and influence in the discipline. So manual and quantitative analysis, some of which I've put on the board. I don't know how well you can read them, but you kind of can see their kind of quantitative analysis. Of kind of citation lists in journals demonstrated that, and kind of manual looking at where references were to, how many counts people got, how many counts books had, argued that influence within human geography is highly skewed. Researchers studied the structure of the research literature in parts of the discipline, the impact and temporal patterns of citation, and kind of linkages of the journal and the field, the relative levels of citation of papers based on whether they were postgraduate works or those more established researchers, and kind of try to identify what they called citation classics, so those authors and texts most frequently referenced, and where they were being referenced and who by, as Wrigley, Bodman, and Whitehand list. However, little sooner than these investigations had begun in the 1980s, with the introduction of formal research grading of citation by the UK's research assessment exercise in 1986, so actually the kind of introduction of these evaluations actually being used to determine jobs and hirings, there was a swift halt in such work, perhaps, as Wrigley argues, owing to the preceding guilt by association of researchers who had previously been engaged in developing these methods. So although such analysis did continue in parts of geography, such as economic geography, and is undoubtedly still used in academic spaces today, lots of these questions about citations and about influence kind of remain unanswered and unpicked up on. Some of the places where they were picked up on in the 1990s is by feminist, queer, indigenous, and decolonial geographers in distinct yet supporting ways to raise attention to the inequalities of their real-world effect in terms of who was being cited. As many have argued, and as Edmund writes, other theoretical positions and traditions tend to be conceptually subordinated to the West if they are cited at all, which leads to the invisibility of some voices and perspectives compared to others. Feminist geographer Gillian Rose drew attention to the persistent erasure of women in the discipline due to what she termed the construction of geography's paternal lines of descent. And she describes how tracing the fathers of the discipline is also a process of constructing the sons and heirs of the discipline, and how this is especially evident when we look at citation practice, which she describes as a legitimation process, in which would-be great men cite already established as great men in order to assert their own maturity, what might be described as the dutiful son model of academic masculinity. In the 20th century, Sarah Ahmed first conceived of citation as a rather successful reproductive technology, a way of reproducing the world around certain bodies. And by policing who can be cited and ensuring that our citations produce these same inclusions and exclusions again and again, she argues that white men cite other white men. It is what they have always done, it is what they will do, what they teach each other to do, and what they teach each other. As Mott and Cockaine describe, this not only excludes women and other minority subject positions, but indeed marks a desire for identification, a privileging of the same over the different. As a result of this naturalized construction, geography risks perpetuating that which Mott and Cockaine describe as a white heteromasculinist hegemony, of who writes geography and for whom it is written. As metist scholar Zoe Todd writes, when we cite European thinkers who discuss the more than human, but we do not discuss their Indigenous contemporaries who are writing on exactly the same topic, we perpetuate the white supremacy of the academy. So scholars working from anti-colonial and anti-oppressive positions have argued for the need to expand who we cite in order to include voices and bodies from those excluded from the majority. Mott and Cochrane describe this too as an ethical practice of conscientious engagement, whereby geographers from more privileged subject positions can work more thoughtfully and deliberately to include those regularly shut out. Intervening in citation practice asks us to rethink what we consider to be good citation practice, whereby the so-called relevant sources are situated in their usual and rightful place, to explore how this authority might be dismantled and remade. But in Living a Feminist Life, Sarah Ahmed refuses to cite any white men whatsoever, and instead cites those who have contributed to the intellectual genealogy of feminism and anti-racism, work which she says lays out other paths that we call desire lines, created not by following the official path laid out by disciplines. Building on Ahmed's work, Wendy Belcher, the author of, which some of you might have come across in your PhD, writing a thesis, a journal article in 12 weeks, he developed this thing called the Gray test, named after the inventor of the hashtag Cite Her Work, Kishonna Gray, and proposes that a journal article must not only cite the scholarship of at least 2 women and 2 non-white authors, but must also mention it meaningfully in the text. And if your article fails the Sperner minimum test, it's biased and should be improved. If you can't find scholars to cite, Belcher writes, it's time for you to do something about the pipeline of scholars entering your field. And yet, as we kind of looked at the beginning of this paper, the space of citation is so much more expansive than that of conscious engagement and that concerning human subjects. And these human subject positions are more expansive and more relational than first appears. As Edith Kincaid, Tariq and Ranjbar write recently, positionality and reflexivity are not only matters of navigating our individual identities, but rather describe how identities are read and positioned within the discipline, and thereby become an issue that extends beyond the boundaries of ourselves. This has been recognised by Indigenous engagements of citation. So, for example, in refusing to cite settler colonial ideologies, Indigenous health researchers Hannah Burgess, Donna Cormack, and Paparangai Reid theorise what they call a kaupapa Maori citational practice, which cites for the futures they envision. And refusing to cite their research, quote, within read descend from the ideas of cis, straight, able-bodied white men, end quote. Burgess, McCormack and Reid instead theorise citation as being perpetually rooted in creation, which, so to quote, generations layer upon each other, creating a reality of intergenerational relationships, perhaps rather like the swirl, which comes from a sketch by Edward Glissant in the back of the slides. In the US, the Cite Black Women Collective, which began in 2017 as quite a public campaign to provoke conversation about where citational practices come from, proposed 5 principles for addressing their challenge. So firstly, it kind of is at the level of the author to read Black women's work. Secondly, to integrate Black women into the core of your syllabus in life and in the classroom, but actually doing more than just making passing reference to the work or taking them into syllabus as an afterthought. Point 3, to acknowledge Black women's intellectual production. Point 4, to make space for Black women to speak. And 5th, to give Black women the space and time to breathe by not making unfair demands of their additional labour to aid in your process of citing Black women. So these propositions provide a means of evaluating what actually counts as this meaningful engagement, reminding researchers that it's not enough to just simply include a citation to bell hooks or Sylvia Wynter, or even just to praise how their work supports or agrees with others from less marginalised positions, as some of my previous researchers kind of tried to do, looking at how Glissant is brought into kind of Jeyasingh studies and to human geography. Rather, the challenge which these work raises is to actually not only just read this work, but see how these ideas change your own ways of thinking and practicing knowledge. However, as Jennifer Nash identifies, these critical challenges to the politics of citation tend to operate according to a logic of more. And as she writes, the call for diversifying citations, which often emphasizes counting citations, puts a premium on the appearance of the number of citations in a particular text as an index of political commitment. With its preoccupation with counting data and numeracy, these logics can easily seem to resonate with the logics of diversity and just inclusion in the citational universe, rather than aspire towards the creation of a completely new system of academic valuation and knowledge construction, end quote. Furthermore, in positioning the figures of Black women and white man as kind of citational polar opposites, as Archie Davis points out, there is a risk that this reifies the borders of the discipline and ends up affirming the very paradigms of Western humanism, which this research seeks to challenge. Black researchers cite other Black researchers, female authors cite other female authors, Indigenous authors cite other Indigenous authors, and so on through many intersections. And personally, this task of trying to ascertain whether a researcher is mixed race or not, and how so can or cannot encounter my own work, promises a headache I would rather avoid. So responding directly to Ahmed's refusal, Catherine McKittrick argues that this actually closes down opportunities to challenge the problem of exclusion and exclusivity, which creates these lines in the first place. So she writes that she struggles with the outcome of Ahmed's citation project. She wonders how it inadvertently turns on impossible foreclosures. What does it mean to read Jacques Derrida and abandon Derrida and retain Derrida's spirit or spectra? Do we unlearn who we do not cite? And what of our teaching practice? Do we teach refusal? Or can we not teach our students to engage with various authors and narratives critically, while also asking them to raise up the work of Black women and other scholars, writers, artists, interviewees, and teachers who go unrecognised? How do we teach each other to read, to disapprove, to evaluate, to critique, use, forget, abandon, remember white men or other powerful scholars? And so McKittrick argues that Ahmed's refusal affords too much power to white men as embodied knowers, and not enough to the more than human practices of sharing how we live this world and might live this world differently. And writes of her own citational practice, how all the words cited, when understood as in conversation with each other, demonstrate an interconnected story that resists oppression. We do not have to like all the words in the work cited. We do have to trust that the work cited are helping us understand and talk about and theorize how to know the world differently. The praxis then is not just about who belongs and who does not belong in the index or the endnotes. Rather, it is about how we collectively are working against racial apartheid and different types of violence. The citation is undoubtedly an important way of referencing where, when, and from whom our ideas come. It connects present research with that which has gone before and that which goes on around us for future researchers to connect with. And thus addressing these humanist politics of citation, as the examples I talked about have done, is doubtless timely, brave, and important work. However, as I argue, addressing this human politics is only one step in fundamentally challenging the perpetuation of colonizing, hierarchical, and privileged ideas about the production, transmission, and connection of knowledge. There is a lot more taking place when we fight than current conventional and critical approaches recognise. So firstly, ideas and influence come from more than human sources, and these measured ways of influence take place through more than human processes. And while the politics of citation certainly includes humans, these human individuals, positions, and subjectivities are always positioned on and produced by a much broader set of lines, which include, yet exclude, yet exceed what we normally think of as individual human researchers. Over the past 2 decades at least, the more than human has become one of the central concerns of geographers seeking to challenge Eurocentric Enlightenment ideals about the primacy of the privileged human subject. To grossly oversimplify very quickly, to refer to the fact that this refers to kind of two not unconnected things. So first, to refer to the fact that the human beings are not the only initiators of activity, meaning, and life. And secondly, to refer to the fact that even these entities, which we take for granted as human, animal or plant or technology, but these individuals are shaped by ways which far exceed Western humanism and its appeals to rationality, volition, and authority. And while surveying this work is beyond the remit of this paper, what's really crucial for me here is the myriad ways which this term has been taken up and understood, and how this warrants a rethinking of the politics of citation to exceed the human. An individual surname and initials represent far wider and array of processes than is usually acknowledged. Number 2, so we cite for reasons more than transparent verification. Revisiting some of the bigger geographical questions about influence and hegemony, which early citation analysis addressed, citation happens for more reasons than we teach undergraduate students. While some of these schemas and lists of different ways of citing might undoubtedly prove helpful in understanding these patterns, the overall outcome of such opaque intentionality is that the network which citations create will always far exceed claims to scientific rationality and mapping and transparent transmission. And thirdly, the lines which citation constructs are more complex than straightforward. For example, how do you reference a mix of ideas encountered in a reading group of a particular text? Or the academic whose ideas have shaped your own work in so many ways, who perhaps prompted you towards the text, but is not necessarily something that you can cite and list. Those ideas which have become so naturalized and attached to your own academic brand, and yet which came from somewhere at some point in time, even if you've kind of forgotten this or can no longer quite put a date and a name on them. So a good way perhaps to think about this oversimplification of lines is through what Natalie Oswin critiques as geography's liberal progress narrative, which tells that the 20th century geography's gradual progression from overtly colonial knowledge through to a diverse and wide array of alternative conceptual frameworks for insight and inspiration. Indeed, this line is kind of pervasive in geography. I started this previous story about citations in the 1980s and kind of moved to present day. However, the problem with such a narrative is that it's far too neat and straightforward and unproblematic, and it assumes this kind of chronological reading of struggle and change, and neutralizes the fact that such turns and changes and events of research and thinking are never simply straightforward, but are much messier, detouring, and ongoing. Moulding such a linear story of progress from exclusive to inclusive, whether that's in terms of our own research or kind of disciplinary ones, glosses over the fact that change has to be actively produced, and it masks the fact that disciplinary threads, questions, and debates are not neatly tied up into history, but continue to perform escapes and punctures in the mainstream. So in the same way, those linear stories of where our ideas come from, so another one which I did here, that kind of start from Bristol to UNSW, undergrad to PhD, neutralizes the rather messy process of producing a singular piece of research, like a thesis or like the seminar and the paper. So the lines on which citation are seen to attest far exceed the straightforward and transparent aspirations of linearity. So to begin to move towards alternative ways of thinking and practicing citation, different ways of evaluating academic influence and ways of looking at the transmission of ideas, I turn to the Martinican thinker Edward Glissant, his critique of filiation and his concept of trembling thinking, because his ideas provide decolonial and relational critiques of why the politics of citation must include and yet exceed humanist concerns. And he suggests alternative lines which citations can instead aspire towards, ones more responsive and creative to northern human life, understood in both senses. The filiation for Glissant is the basis of colonial history. Filial lines begin from the one, an origin or genesis point from which descendants derive their legitimacy. Filiation thus establishes boundaries as to who is included and how, versus who is not and why. And Glissant argued that Western thought has overwhelmingly tended to operate in this way, from Jesus to Shakespearean heroes, Darwinian evolutionary theory to the Oedipal complex. The West, as Glissant saw it, was obsessed with referring to rewarding authenticity based on demonstrating a consistent historical link between the past and the present. And this supports the exclusionary privilege of legitimation by descent. A good example of a filial line, which I've written about elsewhere, is the way that Glissant is frequently introduced to both geography and Deleuze-Guattarian studies as being secondary to Deleuze and Guattari's work, which kind of establishes this hierarchy of who is influential, who is influenced, who is a primary thinker, who is a secondary thinker, whose book you need to read first to understand the others, and leads to both an under-engagement with Glissant's work, as well as a misunderstanding of the context in which Deleuze and Guattari were writing. The filiation left unchallenged allows for the perpetuation of Western exclusive and exclusionary understandings of knowledge production, regardless of the who which makes claim to them. As McKittrick points out, filial geographies are unkind and harmful. And as Spivak writes, this is what makes me a bit leery of the model of the family. Father, mother, competitive patricidal brothers, sisters emerging as support. No kinship system, alas, is comprised only of cousins. So however naturalized filiation might be in the West, filial lines provide a particular shape to how we think and practice geography. Filial lines are the arboreal lines of the family tree, the very best of which are well maintained and kept in shape, and which can be made visible and traced back as far as one is willing and interested in so doing. Filial lines are the ones which can be somewhat planned, managed, and predicted, and thus are useful tools in the perpetuation of the same. And yet, as Deleuze and Guattari argue, the universe does not function by filiation, but rather acts towards the future through unheard of becomings. And thus, while filiation might appear to unproblematically reflect only the past, appealing to origin to gain strength and ascribe evaluations of legitimacy and authenticity, the real power of filiation is its ability to shape the future by providing a key means through which colonizing, hierarchical, and privileged habits can continue their reign. So herein lies the significance of the Caribbean for Glissant, which is where he was from, Martinique. So through the experience of the centuries-long Atlantic slave trade, in which 12 million people were forcibly removed from their homes and transported in part to the Caribbean, during which the native Arawak population were in effect entirely destroyed by the impacts of slavery, disease, starvation, and war, the Caribbean emerges as a place for Glissant where filiation literally cannot take hold. So from this point onwards, it's not only the Caribbean, but the whole world for Glissant, which is brought into a vast network, a terrain populated by lines of detour and oppositic transmission. Whereas filiation might have played an important role in establishing societies of the past, this gives way, following the experience of the Atlantic slave trade, to more rhizomatic ways of creating societies and organising life. So compared with the evocative European tree of the forest on the board, with its deep roots and unambiguous trunk, Glissant in his writing uses Caribbean plants and trees, such as the mangrove, with their entangled roots and branches, living in water and soil, to give a very different sense of what it means to be rooted in place. Because mangrove roots are plural, rather than coming from a single origin point. And thus, as Jonathan Pugh and David Chandler write, the mangrove disturbances and emergent effects open out onto much less predictive, more generative and creative possibilities, which cannot be reduced to linear space-time imaginaries. So the Caribbean thus reveals filiation as yet another Western construct among many. Beginning then from the concrete particulars of the Caribbean, Glissant calls on the world, especially the West, to create more appropriate modes of thinking and living for such a relational condition. Like others, Glissant is critical of the way that nations who have achieved formal decolonisation remain tied to the essential hallmarks of Western and colonial knowledge systems, chief of these being this logic of filiation. So important for the context of my argument in this paper, we can think about how it is not only countries or societies, but disciplines too, which are shaped and can be shaped by others and filial lines as a way of challenging patterns of exclusion and exclusivity, and can instead think about what lines more creatively and transversally look towards the future. And this challenge certainly involves reimagining the human individuals which we place on these lines, but there is also a much broader set of humanist diagrams which too must be dismantled, central to which are these logics of intent, linearity, rationality, and transparency. And thus recognizing that lines do not necessarily have such a clear origin, an obvious direction, and manageable end place as conventional ideas about citation might suggest, provides an opportunity to rethink the wider systems of academic authenticity and legitimacy. So Glissant's concept of trembling. This comes from his later work in the 20th century, much of which still continues to be translated to English today. But in 2004, Glissant organised a conference on the theme of how not to tremble. One of the key presenters here was Derrida, who, emulating the existentialist association of the term with anxiety and personal responsibility, Derrida compared his childhood memory of the bombing of Algiers with the shaking of his hands, which had been preventing him from writing for the last few years of his life, writing that trembling will always remain heterogeneous to knowledge. Trembling is always the experience of absolute passivity, absolutely exposed, absolutely vulnerable, and passive in the face of an irreversible past, as well as in the face of an unpredictable future. And interestingly, this conference was the last time that Glissant and Derrida would meet in this kind of history of quite short and not always entirely friendly, but quite kind of interesting encounters. In comparison, Glissant's talk at the same conference provided a dramatically different use of the concept trembling, one which is more energetic than anxious, more impersonal than existential, more ecological than individual, and more additive than deconstructive. Because for Glissant, it is not that we need to overcome our individual or even our collective trembling in order to achieve knowledge, but rather it is the earth which trembles and we who must learn to tremble with it. And crucially, there is no weakness, no lack or omission in consenting to this trembling, but trembling more ambitiously means challenging that which Glissant calls categories of fixed and imperial thought, because trembling refutes the supposedly solid and filial foundations on which thought, life and action are formed. So there are no more straight paths, he writes, only obscure channels linked to the trembling world. And thus trembling affirms the centrality of movement rather than stasis in thought as in life. As Evans describes, trembling for Glissant is a form of perpetual motion. It circumvents conscious control, making the body a site of errant movement. So for Glissant, trembling reveals the capacity to be moved or overcome, and thus to experience a greater sensitivity of relation. Trembling is less an activation of individual motion and more a release to the perpetual environmental motion. It loosens and blurs bodily boundaries. And so trembling can augment that cerebral shock of the elsewhere, which geographer Tarek Djil argues is necessary to challenge dominant registers of disciplinarity. Strength for Glissant is gained through movement, rather than through stasis and fixity espoused by filiation. This provides a drastically different way of evaluating authenticity and legitimacy of academic work than does the logic of filiation, and it's one which is more attuned to a more than human politics of relations, opacities, and change. The ecology of trembling unsettles thought from the prowess of the intentional human subject, because it is first the earth and its relations which tremble and which already do, and we who must figure out how to tremble with it. So trembling proposes a different sort of relation to thought, which recognizes that stability is only ever temporary, and that movement and change are necessary in order for our thinking to stay afloat. Citations tremble, and it is we who must learn to tremble with them. As Stefano Hani writes, whereas a colonial sense of balance stresses equilibrium from economy to painting, a decolonial balance includes the vestibular of falling down, of being fallen, of being held up by hands, propped up by hands. A decolonial balance is off its axis, elliptical and spinning out of control. It lies down on others, with a rock for its pillow. Trembling thus provides a different mode of evaluation, one which can be attuned to the imminent happenings and occurrences which work to different degrees of effect, rather than limited to transcendent measures of good and bad already constituted prior to the event of coming to write a citation. And one image of this, which I think is quite nice, definitely not my speciality, so please don't ask me about these, is kind of earthquake-proof buildings, which remain strong and stable, not by being unmovable and solid, but actually by building foundations which are capable of moving with the earth while it shakes. So to explore one prime space where citation, where trembling strength and evaluations can come into play, I now think through my conceptualization of trembling citations, what this means and how this might work. So trembling citations refers to both an intervention in citation practice and to think about how this intervention changes broader habits of perception and thought. So it's a kind of a trembling of citations and citations which tremble. Trembling citations include yet exceed individual human authors and sources of influence. They recognise that we cite for more reasons than transparent verification, and they provide an opportunity to explore what other sorts of lines can be drawn of ideas, ones which might open up and create resonances across the connection of thinking. So Glissant's concept of trembling highlights the limitations of current critical engagements with the politics of citation, because the problem is not only the individuals themselves, but the very lines drawn to connect these to one another. It matters whether the disciplinary lines we draw are filial or trembling, because these are ontologically prior. It is along which we come to approach an individual thinker. Regardless of whether they're situated in a minority or a majority, the lines remain the same. Glissantian shows how attempts to try and render the complexity of citation as transparent and linear, according to filiation, descent and origin, always perform a coloniality, regardless of the territory. While trying to give voice to the human sources of our thought might still require, and certainly I would say does require, careful and conventional in-text citations, we can supplement this by trying to tell a more expansive story about where thinking takes place and the evaluations involved in making these decisions about how we voice this. By attuning citation to the more than human registers, we as researchers can aspire to create less hierarchical, less filial, less exclusive and exclusionary ways of thinking and practicing knowledge. I now consider some exemplar and experimental practices with these kind of engagements. So the first one comes from the joint work, The Hundreds, by queer and affect theorists Lauren Ballant and Kathleen Stewart. And in this book, they explore the boundaries of conventional citation practice through what they term formal playing. I'm sorry, these are a bit small on the board. So the book is comprised of 100 more or less 100-word poems, such as the one in the middle, poems and musings about the complexities contained within life's seeming mundanities. And each 100 they write ends with the things that they think with. So encounters, a world, a wrinkle in the neighborhood of what happened, and a reading we wouldn't shake even if we could. So for example, see if I can zoom, I can't zoom. I can't hear when you read this. The one I put on the board, which is checked out okay, they cite Cloud 2020, Khartoum 2013, but also, oh, so annoying, sorry. I see if I've got, this version. So yeah, they cite Cloud 2000, Ericsson 2013, but they also cite 4 boxes of cranberry bread mix, Denger's in general, Vasumi and Manning 2009. And at the end of the book, instead of a final list of references, they provide what they call some things we fought with, which is a picture on the left. So they include academic sources, yes, and these are properly referenced, but they also include things like anti-insanity phone calls and fuck, which they put right after see, shit, see also painkillers, swells. And the ones on the board, which again you can't see, kind of start with occupy, Thomas Ogden, Frank O'Hara, the poet, one word which changes the tone, on the outs, ordinary registers, Evan Osnos, Anand Pandian, Maxfield Parrish, painter, the wah-wah voice of the teacher in Peanuts, pencil and paper, George Perec, Jason Pine, Bitterbread, Edgar Allan Poe, Sonia Postmentier, Moish Postone, and Preppers. These mundane and yet expansive lists of showing where the writing of each 100 comes from testifies to the point that Laura Marx makes elsewhere, that everything that makes us who we are, everything we have, comes from outside us and is only provincially enclosed inside our membrane. The second example comes from Catherine McKittrick, and she opens her book, Dear Science and Other Stories, with a really long list of names of people that she has been experimenting with, and later provides a longer list of songs to listen to show the importance of these musicians who interrupted and complemented these stories, and also provides a link to the Spotify, which is on the left, which I won't read out through. The book itself is interrupted halfway through with a series of close-up photographs of poems, exhibition catalogues, and photographs of celebrities, which are separated from the regular pages of the book by thin sheets of opaque tracing white paper. And one of the pictures is on the board, tracing paper. I unfortunately don't have the book at the moment. Yeah, but even when the kind of photographs are there, like the one you can see on the board, they're uncomfortably zoomed in, and the reader engages with this opacity to gain some understanding, but not complete understanding, with McKittrick, at that which he describes as how I know what I know, where I know from, who I know from, and what I cannot possibly know. And so McKittrick's citation practice begins from these relations and yet goes in all directions, aspiring towards creating new modes of life as opposed to this transparent understanding of where her thought is. And it takes place both in text and outside of the text, through photographs, the book's physical pages, and even on Spotify. Another place which geographers especially have been, we've done really cool work with, is kind of challenging where the human researcher begins and ends through authorship experiments, so such as those by J.K. Gibbs and Graham, the kind of feminist economic geographers, and also Ian Cook et al., who kind of, this is his academic profile. It's not just something he does kind of nicely. The one I want to talk about today is the More Than Human research collective, Bowaka Country, and how they use their authorship to intervene in publishing conventions to challenge where and whom knowledge is produced in and by. So although Bowaka Country on a map can be located in East Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory of Australia, as they write, Bowaka Country is earth, skies, water, animals including humans, plants, processes, relationships, and all other beings that make up Bowaka as homeland. The beings of Bowaka communicate with each other, shape thought and action with knowledges and lives both independent and co-emergent. And so we speak collectively, as far as we can, as human and non-human, tangible and intangible, and everything in between. And it is perhaps no wonder then that academic publishing systems, which again include both human journal editors and more than human algorithms and databases, really struggle with unsettling the assumption that an author is an individual human with a title, first name and surname. And again, sorry, you can't really see on the board, but this is from a page of one of their publications when they basically show how Google Scholar and the kind of journal databases do such a really bad job of including their authorship experiments, basically. As Michelle Lobo articulates, these experiments exceed the subject and celebrate creativity as always emergent from the animation and reanimation of the earth, sky, and sea country that is relational, material, sentient, sacred, more than human, and always becoming. Or, as Nina Williams puts it, a creative in the sense of a process of interpreting the world that also transforms it by forcing us to look at something differently. And what I find provocative about these experimental citation practices is that they come from female, queer, Indigenous, and or Black authors who are variously excluded from the hegemonic subject line, but are done so in ways which push further than individual identity to question where influence comes from beyond human subjects, recognizing the undesirability and unlikeliness of being able to render these ever transparently obvious and clear. So these authors still meet the academic expectation that we show where and with whom our thinking has come from. However, they also push beyond this and provoke questions about what materials, events, and processes are regarded worthy of acknowledgement. There is still a politics to citation here, albeit as one that breaks away from humanist and liberal notions of progress. As Paloma Puente Lonzano suggests in a recent kind of progress paper about the history and philosophy of geography, progressing no longer seems to mean moving forwards, but rather increasingly consists of pushing geographic thinking and disciplinary histories sideways, upwards, downwards, or unexpectedly even further backwards. Citations, in other words, are about beginnings, which take place in the here and now, aiming not for transparent understanding, but to open up and create resonances and connections across the space of thinking. By means of a final example of this kind of experimental practice, I turn to my own Trembling citations, to 3 typewritten sheets as an example of my own experiment of this, which comes from my PhD project. So over my 5 years of living in Canberra, I would periodically visit this building on the left, which is the Museum of Australian Democracy, and specifically its permanent exhibition called Yours Faithfully, which consists of 6 restored typewriters and writing supplies spread across 2 rooms and a balcony. So this museum is housed in the old Parliament House of Australia, much of which is restored for the purpose of educating the visitor about the history of Australian parliamentary politics. And so the original carpets are maintained throughout, as are the original chambers, and a variety of offices, meeting rooms, kitchens, and even bathrooms have been restored, including like the original stationery, dining sets, and towels. And even though Yours Faithfully isn't intended to be a restored space specifically, the room is filled with old cabinets, with maps, with wooden letterboxes and large tables, and with a range of child-friendly prompts in patriotic blue, red, and white about the value of writing letters and a suggestion for what might go on your page. And the point of this room is that it invites visitors to rediscover the art of letter writing, to sit and write something on a typewriter, and the museum will then post it for you free of charge, which is actually really lovely. Unfortunately, I've never actually done this, and I've tended to, every time I've gone, I end up taking them home, which is a bit naughty, but I think it's fine. So in March 21, I happened to find this room while I was actually on a geography field trip taking some of the undergrad students around here. So I came across this room of typewriters and sat down and eventually figured out how to load the paper and started to punch in words. And the sheets which the museum provides are A5, slightly off-white, and of a really satisfying high-quality paper grade. And over the next 3 years, I returned sporadically to use these typewriters, sometimes with friends, as in the photograph, but usually on my own. So sometimes I went intentionally when I'd been feeling a bit down or a bit lost, but not always. And more often than not, it seemed like a kind of nice activity to add to my day. So this museum is across the road from the National Library, where I used to like studying. And especially in those kind of early PhD days of being able to explore with relatively unstructured time and living in a new place. So I found that I really liked typing out quotes which I'd already written down on my phone in the Notes app, which were collated from various things which I'd been reading, ideas I'd been thinking about, and references to events in my life. So sometimes these quotes were from academic books, sometimes they were from the book of text by Derek Jarman on the table, other times, and often they're kind of funny things which people have said or sharp things which come to me at 11 p.m. when trying to sleep and I have to kind of hastily write them down somewhere. And I found that kind of I liked this collection of kind of collating all these different ideas. And it wasn't that I would come with a big plan about what I wanted to write, but I really liked this process of sitting there for an hour or so and just kind of typing and seeing what came through. And while I say these were kind of not planned, they doubtless were produced according to some logics which bypass my conscious intent. So to evaluations about what I deemed significant or not that day. And I found that unlike journaling, which is suggested as a somewhat relaxing way of writing about your existing thoughts, I really liked writing these pieces on the typewriter because they seem to take somewhat disparate ideas and create meaning. So this is the kind of what I felt was a more creative than representational practice. And the very materiality and heritage station of these typewriters themselves, I found really contributed to the task. So figuring out which ones are working on that particular day, an issue with any kind of heritage restored and publicly available products, remembering how to set them up correctly. I would sometimes have people pass through. One instance, to people who had actually worked with typewriters during Parliament previously, who kind of showed me how to use it, which was really cool. The sadness which I would find one which didn't have an exclamation mark on, which I feel like I use quite a lot in my writing. Having the ink run out halfway through and have to change machines, you get this kind of changing gradient of the ink as it goes down. I felt this materiality kind of contributed somehow to that different type of meaning. So somehow the pieces would come together to produce something coherent between all these seemingly random connections, words, thoughts, and lines. And I like to think of this activity as a pre-intentional and pre-individual experiment with the production of meaning and where ideas come from. So maybe, unfortunately, but maybe fortunately for me, I'm not sure how clear these are to you on the board, that these are 3 of the typewritten sheets, which are written across the duration of my PhD project and which evidence or not different parts of my research and attempts to give voice to this more expansive sense of where ideas come from and the lives that they have. So these typewritten sheets show how citations not only validate individual authors existing on various narratives and subject lines, these are there, but they can also be a way of actively unknowing ourselves, creating a space for the more than human to inflect on what we comfortably recognize as our human capabilities. And whilst addressing the conscious decisions about citation is undoubtedly important, citation can also intervene in at the level of unconscious decisions made about before these more dominant registers of sense-making and disciplinarity occur. So who's important, what it is which is considered important. So quotes I liked from books I've been reading sit here alongside seemingly minor, irrelevant, and even boring events. There are some rather personal secrets, more or less visible on here, some of which I've blanked out, some of which aided by this distance. The point is that all of these contribute to what became my PhD thesis, be it perhaps following different lines and dilutions of signification. So looking back at them since finishing, I can really see how so many of the precise lines of argumentation were formed during this process of putting words on a page. So on the top left of the left one, it says non-representational connections and telling a different sort of set of lines. And this is basically what became this chapter in this paper. On the other hand, some of these quotes have also taken on an almost spiritual level in how I understand much more than academic events which have happened to me. such as the quote by Peter Paul-Pelbart on the bottom, who writes, "Encountering is not to existentially collide with someone else, but it is to experiment with the distance that separates us and fly over this distance in a crazy back and forth." And I can scarcely remember anything about, sorry, George, who lent me the book. I can scarcely remember anything else really about the theory in this book, except this kind of way that these quotes and ideas affected me. You know, how can the only way to attribute the importance of a quote like that be an in-text citation or a rather flowery acknowledgement of thanks at the beginning? So these fragments, as Jeyasingh writes, are evidence of something, but evidence of what exactly we can rarely be sure of ahead of the event. And whereas Thomas Jallis suggests classifying these excessive, unruly, and supplementary fragments of research in appendices, by framing these as citations, I want to emphasize how these are always constitutive of ideas deemed worthy of the main body of text. So although these 4 examples are ones which I have used when teaching to encourage students to think about where their ideas come from, to just try and apply these rather singular experiments is not what I'm prescribing here. Rather, these sheets are my way of addressing these questions. The citations at the end of the hundreds are Filial and Stewart's way of doing this. And I invite you as reader and listener to think about what experiment you might offer in your own work and disciplines to rethink the sorts of voices which citations present, the lines in which these are presented, and what these say about the discipline, about yourself as researcher, about the transmission of ideas and of thought itself. So in this paper, I've argued that focusing on changing the human subjects which populate citation can only go so far in challenging the colonizing and hierarchical exclusions and exclusivities of disciplinary practice. What I've called for is a trembling citation practice, which both introduces the tremble into existing citations and which opens up a space to think about how citations can tremble wider academic ideas. So while these contributions might not appear as obviously politically relevant as citing individual writers and thinkers, Trembling challenges the dominant humanism which contributes to perpetuating exclusive habits, assumptions and expectations, which form these very valuations of what counts as intentional, relevant, political and important in the first place. But by problematizing and enriching the geographic terrain on which we think and practice, Trembling citation is a testament to the energy of this ground on which thought and life takes place. Trembling citations problematize both conventional and critical understandings of disciplinary production as is thought to happen down transparent, systematic and filial lines of descent, populated by human subjects alone. While human-centered projects to increase the diversity of authors cited remain crucial, unless interventions are also made into how the discipline functions in more than human ways too, such interventions alone risk perpetuating the hierarchical, privileged and colonizing logics which exclude certain bodies and voices in the first place. As Michelle Lober and Meg Parsons describe, this way of approaching the past does not call for a refusal and dismissal of white knowledge with colonial legacies en bloc, but rather it tries to open up a space that would welcome a chorus of human and non-human voices. These stories might churn and soak in our thinking, and we might begin to be able to dream about how things might be otherwise. So geographers can experiment with voicing a more expansive terrain in which we think, which certainly includes but far exceeds the human. And this is what I have articulated here as a more than human politics of citation. The Trembling citations changes how we engage with others in the discipline too. So in common across different understandings of citation is a respect for the ways which citation has its ability to connect. Trembling citations allow us to think about generating movement to what comes next without necessarily needing to either oppose that which came before as inferior or wrong, or even only as outdated, or to confirm one's place in the filial system by stating your commitment to some origin. And this disrupts linear and liberal notions of progress and temporality, in which that which is to come is always necessarily better. However, it still provides the impetus to want to reinterpret, reimagine, and play with that which has come before to do something better. The references emerge as the materials which any academic researcher draws on to craft singularity of an idea or a piece of writing. This emergence is, as Laura Marx describes, mediative. It is a communicative, mutual sculpting, not a barrier between pre-existing entities, but the very conditions for emergence. This invites us to think of human thinkers and writers less as finished, rarefied individuals who we either respect by preserving or critique by opposing, but as another set of processes among many. As geographer Joe Garlack suggests, the proper name is an it, an ongoing, collective, and sometimes contradictory project. And it's all of this which we bring into the citations of the simplicity of the surname. How we position ourselves in relation to these lines, whether we stomp down on them to attain ground, or whether we architect these to lift up thought, this is one of the crucial choices which we as researchers retain decision-making ability over, in a world in which so much of how we think is already coloured. But to conclude, in a world which trembles, trembling citations both voice this movement and seek to contribute yet more shocks to it, aspiring not towards transparent and systematic value, but rather to complexity and resonance in all sorts of directions. Through engaging with such less than obvious aspects of knowledge production like citation and like critique, geographers can create a different sort of relation towards thought, one which is less possessive over stable origins and fixed boundaries. Such a shift allows a relationally enhancing engagement with and of difference, aspiring to make things anew, however slightly so, within the ongoing flux and chaos within which thought takes place. Thank you all so much.